3 hours. That is how long Iran rained hypersonic missiles onto central Israel in a single unbroken assault. Fatah ballistic missiles hit Mach 15 on re-entry. Khorramshahr warheads carried over 1,500 kilograms of explosives each. Cluster munitions scattered dozens of bomblets across a radius of 10 kilometers before a single interceptor could acquire them. Arrow, David's Sling, and Iron Dome were all overwhelmed. This was Wave 37 of Operation True Promise 4, the longest, heaviest, and most sophisticated strike Iran has launched since this war began. 4 days before this happened, the White House stood in front of cameras and told the world that 90% of Iran's threat had been eliminated. Let that sink in for a moment. What you're about to hear is not what your newsfeed is showing you. Stay with me. Here is what the mainstream narrative gets completely wrong. They see a falling launch count and call it victory. They see interceptors firing and call it protection. They see official briefings and call it the full picture. They are looking at the wrong data. In this video, I'm going to give you 3 things that change everything about how you understand this conflict. First, I'm going to show you exactly why Iron Dome failed at a physics level. Not because it was outnumbered, but because it was built on a design assumption that cluster munitions scatter entirely. Second, I'm going to walk you through Iran's sequencing strategy step by step, a 3-phase military doctrine that was executing in plain sight, while Western analysts were busy counting launch numbers. Third, I'm going to connect this directly to your wallet, your energy bills, and the supply chains that move the goods you buy every single day. Because here is what nobody in mainstream media is telling you. This is not a regional firefight that stays contained inside a map. The economic shockwaves from what happened on March 10, 2026 are already moving through oil markets, shipping routes, and defense budgets in ways that will reach ordinary people far outside the Middle East. The intelligence community did not see Wave 37 coming at that scale. The Pentagon admitted it does not have a complete picture of Iran's remaining operational launchers. A senior American defense official told the New York Times that Iran's ability to damage United States facilities across the Gulf region defied expectations inside the Trump administration. Defied expectations? Read that again. That is not a rounding error. That is a systemic failure of the assumptions underpinning the entire Western strategy in this theater, and the consequences are only beginning to unfold. Let us talk about what is actually confirmed. Not claimed, not speculated, but confirmed by the institutions that have every political reason to minimize what happened. On March 10, 2026, the Israeli Defense Forces held a formal press briefing. In that briefing, the IDF disclosed something that reframes this entire war. Approximately 50% of all ballistic missiles launched by Iran at Israel since February 28th carried cluster bomb warheads, not conventional unitary warheads. These cluster munitions are weapons specifically engineered to defeat the mathematical logic of missile defense systems. The IDF stated directly that Iran has been firing cluster-armed missiles at Israel almost every single day since this conflict began. Think about what that means. Every day for weeks, and the public was not told. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies published a confirming analysis on March 11th. Their assessment was explicit. With Iran's launcher fleet being degraded by Israeli and American strikes, the deliberate shift to cluster warheads is a calculated adaptation designed to extract maximum damage from every individual missile that successfully penetrates the defense envelope. This is not desperation, this is optimization. Now, move to the American side of the ledger. The New York Times published a satellite imagery analysis on March 11th, cross-referenced against verified video footage and official statements. That analysis identified at least 17 American military and allied facilities damaged by Iranian strikes across the Gulf region. 11 of those are United States military installations. The sites include Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, Ali Al Salam Air Base in Kuwait, Camp Arifjan in Kuwait, and the United States Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. Several of these facilities were struck more than once. Satellite imagery captured structural damage immediately adjacent to positions where American THAAD and TPY-2 radar systems were deployed near Al Ruwais in the United Arab Emirates. These are not peripheral installations. These are the tracking and coordination systems that make ballistic missile interception across the entire region possible in the first place. Damage to those radar support structures and communications nodes does not just damage a building. It degrades the eyes of the entire defense network. Estimated damage to the 5th Fleet headquarters alone reached approximately $200 million. At Ali Al Salam, at least 6 structures tied to satellite communications. Infrastructure were destroyed or severely damaged. On the ground inside Israel, the Alma Research and Education Center's verified daily casualty report, as of March 10th, documented 14 civilians killed, 2,339 injured, and more than 3,000 residents displaced by direct missile impacts and falling interception debris. The single deadliest event of this entire conflict remains the March 1st strike on Beit Shemesh. An Iranian ballistic missile penetrated a communal bomb shelter built beneath a synagogue. 9 people were killed, 3 of whom were teenage siblings. The IDF confirmed that 2 interceptors had been fired at that missile, and both failed. 2 interceptors, both failed. 9 people dead in a shelter that was supposed to protect them. That is not a statistic. That is the ground truth of what Iron Dome's limitations look like in human terms. Now we go deeper, because the data points I just gave you are not isolated events. They are symptoms of 3 interconnected failures that nobody in official channels wants to discuss in the same breath. A physics failure, a strategic failure, and an intelligence failure. When you see all 3 together, the picture that emerges is fundamentally different from anything you're being shown on your newsfeed. Layer 1 is the physics failure. Every missile defense system ever built operates on a binary assumption. There is one warhead following a calculable arc. You fire an interceptor and you either hit it or you miss it. Hit equals safe. Miss equals damage. That is the entire mathematical foundation of Arrow, David's sling, and Iron Dome. One threat, one solution, binary outcome. Cluster munitions annihilate that logic entirely. Here's the mechanism. A cluster warhead does not detonate as a single explosion. It is engineered to open at altitude and release between 20 and 24 submunitions, each carrying several kilograms of high explosives, scattering across a dispersal radius of up to 5 kilometers before any individual bomblet reaches the ground. The warhead does not arrive as one threat. It arrives as 24 simultaneous threats, each on a slightly different trajectory, each too small and too numerous for a system designed to track a single re-entry vehicle to engage individually. If the interceptor reaches the missile before the warhead separates, the threat is contained, but these weapons are specifically engineered to separate at altitude outside the optimal intercept window. Even when an interceptor successfully destroys a cluster-armed missile, the force of that detonation can rupture the warhead casing and scatter the bomblets outward anyway. The defense system scores a kill, but the submunitions still reach the ground. This is not a flaw in Israeli execution. This is a fundamental architectural vulnerability that no currently deployed interceptor system in the world is designed to solve. Iran identified that vulnerability and built its entire warhead strategy around it. 50% cluster munitions is not a coincidence. It is a doctrine. Layer 2 is the sequencing strategy. Zoom out from the individual weapon and look at the campaign architecture across the full timeline. When you do, a 3-phase operational sequence becomes visible that was executing in plain sight the entire time. Phase 1 ran from the opening days of the conflict through approximately day 6. Iran fired in volume, 90 launches on day 1, 65 on day 2, 25 on day 3. The official narrative watched that declining number and declared progress. Analysts credited joint suppression operations with eliminating up to 75% of Iran's operational launcher fleet. The White House presented the falling launch rate as proof the campaign was working. But volume was never the objective of Phase 1. Saturation was. Iran was not trying to maximize damage in the opening waves. It was probing and stress testing every layer of the defense network simultaneously to identify which systems were slowest to respond, which radar bands were most congested, and which intercept corridors were most predictable. Phase 1 was reconnaissance disguised as bombardment. Phase 2 was the systematic decapitation of the detection infrastructure. The Hyla satellite communications relay south of Tel Aviv was struck twice. THAAD and TPY-2 radar support structures were damaged across the Gulf region. 11 United States military installations were hit. The communications and tracking architecture that coordinates ballistic missile defense across the entire theater was being methodically degraded, while the Western press was still reporting on launch count reductions. Radars first, communications second. Then, the heavy warheads arrive into an environment that can no longer see them coming or coordinate a coherent response. Phase 3 was Wave 37, 3 continuous hours. Fatah hypersonic missiles reaching Mach 15 on re-entry, and Khorramshahr ballistic missiles carrying cluster munitions. 5 distinct missile systems were fired in overlapping waves across a single operational period, each one calibrated to stress a different layer of what remained of the defense network. They were fired not into the robust, fully operational system that existed on day 1, but into the degraded, partially blinded architecture that Phases 1 and 2 had spent weeks methodically dismantling. Intelligence analysts are now looking at whether this sequencing reflects a deliberate adoption of what military theorists call a reconnaissance strike complex, a doctrine traditionally associated with advanced state militaries, not a sanctions-constrained regional power operating under years of export controls. If that pattern holds, it represents a significant evolution in Iranian operational doctrine that was either missed or underestimated by Western intelligence prior to this conflict. Layer 3 is the intelligence failure, which brings us to the most consequential admission of this entire war. It did not come from a whistleblower or a leaked document. It came from the New York Times, sourced to senior United States defense officials, and published in plain language on March 11th. Iran's ability to damage American facilities across the Gulf region defied expectations inside the Trump administration. Parse that sentence carefully. Defied expectations is not neutral bureaucratic language. It is the most restrained possible way of saying that the pre-war intelligence assessment was wrong in its fundamental assumptions about what Iran could reach, what Iran could damage, and what Iran had already prepared to execute. The planning assumptions were built on a model of Iranian capability that did not match the Iranian capability that actually showed up on the battlefield. The Pentagon confirmed it does not have a complete picture of how many Iranian launchers remain operational after weeks of strikes, thousands of munitions expended, and repeated official declarations of a launcher fleet destruction reaching 80 to 90%. The institution responsible for targeting those launchers admitted it cannot fully account for what is left. The White House said 90% of the threat was eliminated on March 6th. Wave 37 arrived on March 10th. That 4-day gap is not a communications problem or a media failure. It is the distance between the war that was being described and the war that was actually being fought. That distance has consequences that extend far beyond the borders of Israel and Iran. Here is where this stops being a foreign policy story and starts being your story. The decisions made in Tehran, Washington, and Tel Aviv over the past 10 days are now moving through systems that touch every person watching. There are 3 chains of consequence, each already in motion. Chain 1 is the Strait of Hormuz and what it means for your energy costs. 20% of all global oil supply transits the Strait of Hormuz. Not 20% of Middle Eastern oil, but 20% of the entire world's daily petroleum flow moves through a waterway that is approximately 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. On March 10th, the United States military destroyed 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels near that strait. That operation was not a patrol. It was a preemptive strike triggered by intelligence indicating Iran had already begun preparing to deploy naval mines across the choke point. Think about what that tells you. Iran was not threatening to close the strait. Iran was in the process of closing the strait. The interdiction stopped the operation this time. Meanwhile, Maersk and multiple major international shipping firms have already suspended or rerouted key sailings through the region. Marine insurance premiums for Gulf transit have spiked. Every additional kilometer those vessels travel on alternative routes adds cost. That cost does not disappear. It moves forward through the supply chain until it reaches the price of the goods sitting on the shelf in front of you. If the strait closes for even 72 hours, energy markets will react within hours. And price shocks do not stay inside energy markets. They accelerate inflation across every sector that moves, manufactures, or refrigerates anything. Chain 2 is the arsenal depletion problem, and who pays for it? Every Arrow 3 interceptor costs approximately $3 million per unit. Every time Israel fires a salvo of 2 interceptors at a single incoming missile, that is $6 million expended in approximately 90 seconds. Wave 37 lasted 3 hours. Multiply that across weeks of sustained exchanges, and you are looking at interceptor expenditure rates that are straining Allied stockpiles in ways that defense ministries are not publicly quantifying. The United States is actively resupplying Israeli air defense inventories, and that resupply competes directly with American commitments elsewhere. Intelligence analysts are examining whether the current rate of interceptor consumption in this theater is creating measurable inventory gaps that affect American deterrence posture in the Pacific. The question being asked in certain defense circles is pointed. If a second crisis erupts near Taiwan, while interceptor stockpiles are being drawn down to sustain operations in the Middle East, what does the response calculus look like? This is not speculation. This is the standard logistical arithmetic of running simultaneous deterrence commitments with finite industrial production capacity. That arithmetic has a direct line to defense budget allocations, procurement contracts, and ultimately to the tax base that funds all of it. Chain 3 is the cluster munitions precedent and the rules that no longer hold. More than 100 countries have signed the Convention on Cluster Munitions, banning these weapons because of their indiscriminate nature and the unexploded ordnance they leave embedded in civilian environments for years. Iran has not signed, Israel has not signed, the United States has not signed. Iran just demonstrated at scale, in a live, high-visibility conflict, that cluster-armed ballistic missiles are an effective tool for defeating the most sophisticated missile defense architecture in the world. That demonstration was watched by every military procurement office on the planet. If this pattern holds, the normalization of cluster munitions as a standard ballistic missile warhead configuration in regional conflicts is no longer a theoretical concern. It is an emerging battlefield standard. And the humanitarian infrastructure, clearance organizations, and medical systems that deal with unexploded ordnance are not scaled for a world where this becomes routine. The consequences of what happened on March 10th are not contained inside a map of the Middle East. They are already traveling outward through oil prices, defense budgets, and the slow erosion of the rules that were supposed to make modern warfare marginally less catastrophic. The most important question has not been answered yet. Here's where we are. Iran just demonstrated that a sanctions-constrained regional power operating under decades of export controls and international isolation can systematically blind the most expensive and sophisticated missile defense architecture ever assembled. It did not do this by accident or through sheer volume. It did this through a sequenced, layered operational campaign that identified structural vulnerabilities and exploited them in the correct order. Radars first, communications second, and heavy warheads into the darkness. Wave 37 did not arrive into the defense environment that existed on day one. It arrived into the degraded, partially blinded architecture that 36 previous waves had spent weeks methodically dismantling. If this sequencing continues, then Wave 38 does not face what Wave 1 faced. It faces something significantly worse. The White House narrative and the battlefield reality are now separated by a distance that no press briefing can close. The Pentagon does not have a complete picture of what Iran has left. The Strait remains open today, but interceptor stockpiles are being drawn down and the cluster munitions precedent is already set. None of these trajectories have reached their endpoint. This story is not finished, it is accelerating. The next development in this conflict will not announce itself with a warning. It will simply arrive. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because when Wave 38 comes, you will want to be prepared.